Week 8. Do evaluations this week. It's Monday, 10/14. NET-134 IT Essentials. Focus on learning. We looked at, watched a video on learning, and we looked at the list, and we talked about it in preparation for the evaluation on chapters 1 through 4. More on that here in a little bit. Terms and concerns, we covered those during the class time. We did some more work here. We're still working with the Wi-Fi. We haven't quite finished that up. We finished that Wednesday after the evaluation. They work some more on the Wi-Fi, plus we connected to a separate network. More on that here in a little bit. Network evaluation will be Wednesday of next week. Next week, Monday, is Chapter 6. And we need to be working on Chapter 7. We'll actually start talking about that on Wednesday. Wrap up 6 and get started on 7. So we did a little bit of review from it would be chapters 1 through 4. I talked about components, talked about power supply. Should be familiar with power supplies and like some of the issues dealing with getting power to the motherboard and other devices. So I suggested they create some notes on these items. Another component, the motherboard, and then that would determine how many slots you have. PCI Express, type of processor that'll work. We talked about the front end bus and memory, the different types of memory. And what I would do is I'd go back and review a little bit, a couple of different things in memory, maybe jot a few notes down about that. And then storage, we talked about magnetic storage, SSD, and then M.2. This storage we can plug into a slot and get access to the processor that way. Processor and memory. Talked a little bit about RAID not being backup, and you'd have to have at least 2 disks to do mirror, 3 disks to do striping in terms of RAID for redundancy. So if you lost a disk, you'd have another one to replace it. As far as software in the first 4 chapters, we did a lot of talk about the BIOS, different features and so forth, the BIOS, and then we also talked about thin and thick clients. In a client-server environment, thin client accessing via network, a thick client, really like the PCs we have in class. So that pretty much covers the things in chapters 1 through 4. 5 and 6, we talked about static IPs. For example, a server, when we talked about this client-server relationship. We asked for examples. They said like putting into a server, or even accessing a web page, a web server. IP and naming services. And what we're most familiar with is domain name services. Dynamic IP, we talked about the DHCP process. We looked it up in Wikipedia. It has a pretty good explanation of how it works, and it's also in the curriculum. And we mentioned a little bit about IP6, getting addresses dynamically. Then we did some lab work. I had a router set up. And a switch. Students connected their PC to the switch, got an IP address from the router. The router was doing DHCP, and we looked at that in the router. This was the default gateway, the address right here in the router for these PCs. This was the network, the mask, and then the router connected to a switch in the room, which connected to the multi-layered switch, which eventually goes out the firewall. NAT here was going from a private to a public address for out on the internet. This NAT was going from this network to this network. So we took the addresses from here and NATed them to this network so we could pass the traffic through that network. The router did DHCP down to the workstations, and it also received its address using DHCP. Actually got it from up here, from this device. And then we looked at inside the router. We looked at the routing table. We looked at the interfaces. And we looked at ARP. So we could see how the IP from the workstation was matched up with the MAC address from the workstation. So when traffic was coming back, let's say coming back from the internet, it gets translated here, and then when the router sends it out to the switch, it puts the correct MAC address with that IP address, so then it goes to the correct PC. We'll cover that more later on. We did a little bit with terminology. At home, when they say it's a wireless router, it's really a router, a switch, and an access point. It's really all three of those things. Connected, in this case, through a cable modem into the internet. Some generic things we talked about. Air and materials. There was a bad port number listed here, and we cleaned it up. We actually ICANN, and then we looked it up and we got the exact list for port numbers. Talked about port numbers for server and client for DHCP. Talked a little bit about the difference between routers, switches, and access points. Getting access into the network, IEEE 802.3, 802.11, Ethernet, Wi-Fi. Almost done for today. They could, from their devices, if they were still connected, they could telnet to the router using an address in the router, 192. Here, let me back that up. 168.1.1. That was the default gateway in the router. So if you're on that network, you could enter that into PuTTY, set it for Telnet. Then when you need a password, it was Cisco, and then you could look at this particular information. We'll take a look at that again on Wednesday, briefly. All right. One more thing. Review/study the materials from chapters 1 through 4. That's Wednesday at the beginning of class. Monday, chapter 6 exam. Wednesday, we have a chapter 5 and 6 evaluation. All right, that's it.